The Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, or VYM, is known as the go-to ETF for dividend-focused investors that want exposure to some of the best companies in the entire world. VYM offers diversification, a nice starting dividend yield, and on top of that has also seen substantial growth in the price return since inception. Now in this video, we're going to be doing a complete overview on VYM and see exactly how the ETF works and what it has to offer for investors. Then later on, we are going to seek to answer if or if not VYM is even worth investing into, moving forward in a landscape where there are so many other incredible options these days. Now stick around because you are not going to want to miss something that recently happened with VYM, which could change some investors' minds when it comes to if or if not VYM is a buy or sell. I just finished my brand new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from zero to now over 7 figures invested, and also on how I earned more than $6,000 per month in dividends. I also finished my custom dividend tracker that you can use to track your dividend income progress on an ongoing basis. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. Now heading over to the Vanguard website to learn a little bit more about VYM and what it has to offer. It says Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF. And the product summary says it seeks to track the performance of the FTSE High Dividend Yield Index, which measures the investment return of common stocks of companies characterized by high dividend yields. Also provides a convenient way to track the performance of stocks that are forecasted to have above average dividend yields. Now VYM does also offer a very cheap expense ratio of just 0.06%, which is sort of industry standard for this sort of ETF. Now looking a little bit deeper into VYM's performance, it's up 120% on the max time frame, and this is back since around 2006, and this is of course just price return, which is pretty impressive. VYM currently is trading towards the high end of the 52-week range, so it isn't necessarily offering the best buying opportunity. But for longer term investors, as you can see, this thing has pretty much went up and to the right over time, and you're going to see exactly why in a second. Now the reason this ETF has performed so well is of course because of the holdings. There's currently around 453 different holdings inside of VYM, which makes it very diversified and why I would consider this ETF basically an ETF that will allow you to sleep very well at night, knowing that you're well diversified with some of the best companies in the world. Now the current breakdown for VYM is mostly financials at almost 21%, then consumer defensive at 14%, healthcare at 12.5%, industrials at 11.9%. Then we have a smaller amount of energy, technology, utilities, consumer cyclical, communication, basic material, and real estate. Now out of the top 10 holdings, there are some names in here that I'm a huge fan of and a few that I'm not as big of a fan of, but overall they're all pretty solid. The majority of VYM currently is JP Morgan, ExxonMobil, we got Broadcom, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, the Home Depot, Merrick, abbvie, we have Chevron, Pepsi, and like I said, plenty of other names also to make up the ETF. But when it comes to dividend growth and VYM, this ETF does definitely deliver. VYM's offering a 3.01% trailing 12-month dividend yield. Now, although 3% might not seem like all that much for some of you income-focused, cash flow chasing investors out there, 3% is not all that bad considering there is some substantial dividend growth, and also because you are getting such a strong basket of holdings that also have the potential to grow in price over time. Now, VYM's trailing 12-month dividend growth rate is 4.26%, the 3-year dividend growth is 5.25%, the 5-year dividend growth rate 5.6%, and then the 10-year around 7%. So like I said a second ago, pretty strong dividend growth, not the fastest dividend growth necessarily of all time, but very, very consistent, which is exactly what VYM is. But speaking of dividend growth, we do have something crazy to go over. Just as of recently, in December, VYM did announce a massive December dividend of $1.10, which just in comparison, 1 year ago, the 2022 December dividend was 97 cents. So $1.10 over 97 cents is like a 12% increase, which is massive dividend growth year over year. And for those of you that might not understand exactly what I mean by this and why this is so substantial, for the investors that bought into VYM this time last year, if they just held on to VYM for 1 year, didn't sell their shares of VYM, let's say, they are getting paid 12% more in December, year over year in cash flow. Now going back a little bit further, you can see that back in 2021, there was a 94-cent dividend paid, so 2021 to 2022 wasn't as big of an increase, but just as of recently, a massive increase, which definitely has the entire dividend growth community pretty buzzing, especially because a lot of investors have been holding on to VYM for a while and waiting for that massive substantial dividend increase. But zooming out even further, if we look at December around 10 years ago or so, if we look at December of 2013, we're looking at a 53-cent dividend. So now about 10 years later, the dividend has doubled. which means that at least in theory, investors could assume that 10 years from now, there could be a chance that the dividend could even be $2.20 per share. Who knows what's going to happen in the future, but the dividend growth has been pretty substantial so far. Now, lastly, I thought it'd be pretty fun to stack up VYM next to the S&P 500 and, of course, next to one of VYM's main competitors. And if we were to use the metric total return, which is basically dividends plus price return included, and look at the performance of VYM compared to these other two over multiple different time frames, VYM year to date is up 5.39%. S&P 500 is crushing it, up 23.41%. Remember, the S&P 500 is the benchmark for a reason. Then SHD is up 3.75%, so at least year to date, VYM is beating SHD, but not even close to that of the S&P 500. Now, over the last 1 year time frame, pretty much more of the same. S&P is on top at 21%, then VYM at 5%, SHD at 3%. Over the last 3 years, though, things definitely shift around quite a bit. Over the last 3 year time frame, VYM is on top at 33% return, total return that is. Then we have SHD at number 2 at 30.63% return, and then S&P 500 is lagging at 27.73%. So it is pretty interesting to see that over multiple different time frames, again, depending on what stocks are made up within these different ETFs. Although, of course, to be fair, there is also some crossover. It's crazy to see that some of these different dividend growth ETFs are even outpacing that of the S&P 500, at least on certain time frames. And it's going to be interesting to see that if over the next year or two, another leaf will be turned over, because some of these dividend growth ETFs, like SHD, for example, have not performed all that well during a time where the S&P has been crushing it. But lastly, on the longest time frame, this is super interesting. On the 5 year time frame, SHD is up 88.68% at number 1, then S&P 500 at 85%, and then VYM at 63.36%. Now, of course, I always have to say this to make things very clear. I think, at least in my opinion, investing into either SHD, S&P 500, or VYM are all relatively very safe options for long-term investors. At least that's what we've seen historically. Of course, during crashes, pretty much everything's going to go down. Nothing's really safe. But over the long term, pretty much all these have performed very well over pretty much any time frame. But that being said, over the last 5 years, SHD does come in front just a little bit, although most recently that is not the case. Now, the last thing you guys might be wondering is if or if not VYM, the Vanguard High Dividend Yield Index, is currently in my portfolio as of right now. Now, I currently do have a few shares of VYM in my portfolio that I've been holding for a few years now, but I really am much more of a fan of SHD because it does have a little bit faster of a dividend growth rate, at least it has historically over different time frames. And also SHD does offer a little bit of a higher starting dividend yield, which I definitely like, being more of an income-focused, dividend-focused investor. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that SHD is better than VYM or S&P 500. Like I said, I think any of these could be good options for pretty much any investor out there that's looking for price return, dividend growth, and dividends off the bat. But now I want to hear from you guys down below when it comes to VYM. Do you personally think that VYM, the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, still has the juice that it had at one time? Or do you think in a landscape with so many different ETFs that are all offering potential massive gains, do you think there's a better ETF out there? Comment yes or no down below, and if you have a better ETF, drop the ticker down below also. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.